Hello everyone, today we talk about the Roman popular assemblies in the 4th century BC, according to Livy, and generally speaking what we know about these councils and how the essentially Roman political voting system worked. The Indo-European etymologies I will be adding essentially signify this ancestral connection of the Roman political and civil values to actually the original ones of the time of the Italic invasions, which is a topic we have to visit a bit more often. Telling the truth, I, as you know, made lots of videos about the Roman conquest of Italy, so we are looking at a time in history towards the end of the 4th century BC, and so the same end of the Samnitic Wars and the fact of Roman affirmation on the entire peninsula hegemonically. Of course, a moment of still great connection of the Romans with their sense of tribal ancestry, but also the civic one, properly stemming from the military service connected with, in fact, the voting right. And so that great step forward that the Roman constitution had taken in the 4th century, like essentially at the beginning of it, and that had essentially involved the humilas as well into the exercise of arms. And in order to explain this and why it had happened essentially from the originally feudal nature of the Roman establishment, the oligarchic one, the heroic one, if you want, look in sort of pre-statal times, is really the key understanding of also the war political system. Very often these topics are presented just like, okay, this is a civic thing, people went voting, and this is just, you know, people out there without we often forget how, in a sense, of course, a source like Livy, for example, is talking from a much later time, which the majority of the Roman citizenry had lost that capacity, especially of being, say, autonomous regarding their political and military contribution in many ways. And so, if at the beginning of Roman history you needed land in order to be a soldier, in Livyan times, of course, in order you would become a soldier in order to get land. And so I don't have to digress on the Roman crisis of recruitment of the 2nd century BC. We have other videos incoming exactly on the Gracchus times, for example, that we never discussed much in depth. So step by step we'll be covering everything, but I also presume that you're sort of more or less well acquainted with the fundamentals of Roman history to grasp the references that, of course, I'm discussing. So in order to spice up a little bit the list of terms and the explanation of how the political system worked, I attached a bit of Indo-European etymologies to, in fact, to the aforementioned terms, in order to, in fact, restore a bit like the genuine, let's say, understanding that in the 4th century the Romans would have of these terms also in this electoral political system. All right. And given that we're talking about popular assemblies, of course, we have to define what the populace is, which is a really thankless job that actually I'm not going to do in the bigger way, of course, because there is all the issue about senatus populusque, what did that really mean, was the populace, all right? The popular assemblies were called like this because they grouped all the Roman populace. That is to say, the entire civic community of the Curiates, right? So populus comes from from Old Latin, right? And it appears since the mid-2nd century BC in our sources from the earlier populus, right? From the even earlier populus, attested already since the 5th century BC, from the Proto-Italic populus, which stands for army, right? And the further origin is relatively unknown. Perhaps it stems from the Etruscan, which may have actually had some Indo-European roots in this for this term as well, or from the root of pleo, right? When you look at the Etruscan toponym Popluna, you can understand that there is some connection with that political sense of political community. And the connection with the Latin verb pleo, that is to fill, to say, think about replenish, like comes from the same term, may seem unclear due to the at least apparent semantic difference, but there is surely some consonance between populus and, for example, the other Indo-European terms like the Proto-Germanic fulca or fulcum, that is surely also connected with the ancient Hellenic plethys, that we get like the idea of plethora, of the sort of multitude, right? That refers to this body of essentially freemen making up an entire community, just like the people, the folk. So we're not really, this is, say, the linguistic aspect is the least ambiguous in many ways. We know what, at least essentially later, the populace really meant, not even fully in that sense. For example, at the time of Cicero, still you had the expression populus plebesque Romana. This is mostly the idea, because today when we think about the people, right, we sort of modernize and secularize the term by saying basically everybody, because again we live in a post-traditional world, essentially, at least in the formalities, as far as the lack of estates and classes and actual castes, like it was also in the Romano-Italic world. And so Cicero there meant that populus and plebs were, of course, initially distinguished, right? And that the populus was just like the synonym with the quirites, so the covirites that I think, well, I will explain also that etymology, but it's kind of obvious, really meant, right? So populus would be the army, no more, no less. And so initially, actually just a part of what we would call in modern terms the people, right? There was the magister populi. Essentially, the idea we've seen in the video about feudal Rome is that this was initially just a patrician prerogative, and therefore, like the one of the free men of their clans, as opposed to the rest of the plebs that were essentially the fourth estators, and that this is naturally also debatable in the measure in which we do not have direct sort of explanation, evidence, etc. But obviously enough, the concept that there had been a stock of conquerors back in the day that had, of course, won a superior status in every sense, metaphysically, politically, socially, that had the right to bear arms, and the rest of say the subjected population, or simply the one that had fallen behind in some ways, you could be enslaved for many reasons, not just like being a conquered foreigner. But as we were pointing out before, it's only in the 4th century that the Romans begin to extend in this truly manumitary way, right, of properly elevating, with that, say, fulfilling that sense that Indo-European evangelion of world domination, those, disadvantage that were thought, in fact, not to have properly the right, right? Nobody would have, we will connect this properly with the one of imperium, because at the same time, you start having plebeian magistracies provided with the imperium, and this is really a massive game changer in just also in institutional terms. But obviously it wasn't like just such a smooth process, as you know, because the clashes between the patricians and plebeians were pretty intense. We will have to talk about them. But the it happens all the times in Western history, like that you have an enlightened elite that basically gives the possibility of these marginated to prove themselves fundamentally as soldiers, right? Fighting for a greater hegemonic plan and winning their own freedom in the process, right? And I explained a bit this again in that series I made on the Roman conquest of Italy that you can find. I also made some videos about Romano-Italic warfare because it's very, very, very important to understand how the enemies of Rome became Romans at a point, which of course goes against the idea that the Romans were merely exterminating, or in fact having this destructive idea in their mind. We're actually following like an unprecedented sense of say generous concept of imperium dispensation. Was actually incredibly violent and traumatic and rigid and overwhelming, but that differently from other peoples was really extend this to an unprecedented level of in fact also of effort, right? That the people who were to obtain it underwent, but that in fact made the incredibly courageous Romano-Italic confederacy that would eventually take over the literal world. So this concept is incredibly relevant, especially when we connect it with the same concept of Quirites, which stands for co-virites, that is the exercitus populus, and that obviously comes from vir and the Indo-European viros, and so the man per se, so the warrior, the husband, the hero, the same term from which actually it's the concept of virtus that is connected with it in the first place. It's actually present in all Indo-European languages, basically. Like we came through, through Latin, eventually to speak this word in terms of virtue, etc., through the Renaissance, the Latinate, the Italianate culture of early modern Europe. But this is something that lays deeply at the root of the entirety of the Indo-European community. And the beauty of this is that the same concept of civitas, right? And when you hear in Indo-European k, like the K, the hard sound, just know that that was the single most important phoneme in the Indo-European language, and all the most, in fact, sacred etymologies were, in fact, defined by this. Let's say the celestial. This, in fact, called like this idea of grouping, of unity, right? Of, in fact, of community derives from this. In the Roman case, civis comes, so citizen comes from the Old Latin cavis, from the Proto-Italic cavis, and the Proto-Indo-European K, which means, by the way, and this is incredibly important, to settle, to be lying down. And as we'll see now, there are other, terms in Latin, in political, institutional Latin that refer to this, together with the Indo-European roots, and so other terms in other languages that really show this beautifully, that have to do properly with the idea that we have observed very often, especially when, I don't know, we talk, for example, about the migration era, all right, as medievalists, right, and the crucial idea of the foundation of the state. Like many people see, that period, the idea of the conquest again as incredibly, in fact, illiterate and incivil idea of everything that was before was destroyed. Yeah, we're going to bank it on the ruins, on the ashes. None of that. First of all, the people who were conquering there were trying to preserve at all costs literally every single thing that existed, because that was the actual imperium of the Holy Citadel, together with the Romanity of the empire, for that matter. And aside from that, it posed the most obvious problem of creating a territorial state that for these conquerors, whether we're talking about the Italics of the first millennium BC, or the Germans or of the 5th or the 6th century AD, was always the same, like passing from a nomadic, semi-nomadic origin to a sedentary one, which came, of course, through the necessity of founding a state. So the idea of citizenship being born with the necessity of political cohesion, of deriving from territorial control, and so the level of administration and organization that you couldn't do without just like being some, nomadic raider out there, right? So the foundational moment in these languages stems from the literal necessity of settling down and starting to reason in different ways from the ones that had existed before, but not actually forgetting the original mores in this case, right? So the Roman citizenry, the civitas romana, both the originary one, the one of the ingenui, or the one acquired through manumission, so through enfranchisement, as for the liberti, consists in a system of complementary rights and duties, by the way, unequally reparted. Now, this is something we'll especially see in some other video, but the idea is that there is a deep and necessary inequality based on the quality of the people, right? This is crucial. It's the single most important traditional value. There is no greater lie than equality among human beings, right? It's a sacrilegious, heretical, and fundamentally anti-moral and anti-scientific, not immoral or unscientific, anti-moral and anti-scientific principle to presume otherwise. Regarding the etymologies, now, ingenui, ingenuus singular, has a beautiful etymology. It refers essentially to, as we just said, the originary Roman citizenry. So as we have seen, even just by etymology, the one stemming from the original settlers, the original Italic Indo-European invaders. And it has come to acquire sort of different shades of this, because in some European languages there are some, for example, if you look at the word disingenuous, like there is the sense that the term may refer to some primal lack of, like even of malice, right, of naivete in some languages is translated, including Italian, by the way. This is interesting. And it bears the actual concept of, in fact, this unspoiled, pure, primal, virginal, and in fact, Solar was all connected with the idea of the spring, with the ver Italicum, and all the sense of this new race, this new progeny, stock of, in fact, of the fresher, right, force coming to rule the world and expanding the world. So from the war bands, like of the Indo-European culture. And the term ingenuus is connected with the Proto-Italic ingenuos and with the Proto-Indo-European root hen, which is connected in other languages with terms like even egg, for example, the inside, right, the tender part, and it's connected also with the with offspring, for example, and with the sense even of tenderness even. And this is connected, we'll have to make a video about this, but to the primal divinity of the race, because our own incarnation basically is a product, traditionally, of this becoming harder, like rock, so losing life and losing divinity in this regard. Think about Mithras' myth, right? The idea that this guy was initially a literal rock, and eventually he becomes the sun, himself after having defeated the sun, which is the extreme, right, of the possibility of winning over death through divine force, from which technically also matter comes, because everything comes from that. And so the idea is that the more creation has fallen, the more rigid it becomes. And the idea was also that our own bones, for example, are would have been in the origins like something softer, and the whole individual would have eventually transcended to some spiritual, in the sense, not quite immaterial in the sense that, like in the dualistic heresies of Gnosticism, etc., like the two things are separated, but that literally, our sense of spirituality is something dramatically superior to what we see as this simple collateral result, right, of reality of the world, the incarnation, matter, that we are ourselves responsible for. It's not being created for us. It's our own, let's say, in its really, so negative, deadly, say, reality, the physical reality that essentially eats you alive, and is taking away, in fact, energy from you without spending it. That basically is only the product of your mind. And so just a mere illusion. And so the fear associated with it is just the reason why that materiality exists. And in the origin of Genus and of Hen and so on, at the root, there is this embryonal reality that is tenderer and unspoiled and originary, right? And so this term comes to mean also in Latin different things, like, for example, in some ways natural, indigenous, freeborn, noble. So you see a wide range of terms that have always the same connection: upright, frank, candid, ingenuous itself, as it was transliterated, delicate, tender as well, which all look at this different aspects of the term, and that have to do with this idea of how the world came to be, right? So you could be this ingenus by birth, essentially, and so by genetic continuity, or you could become a Roman citizen, as we've seen, also by being liberated, right? And the interesting aspect of the libertus etymology is that it's also connected with the people. It comes from the old liber comes from the old Latin liber, the Proto-Italic liberos, and so also the Indo-European levteros, which ultimately is connected with lev, that is people still, but in another sense. For example, the eleuteroi, right, as the free people in a sense, but in there are terms of this kind, and it refers to pertaining to the people, but not in the sense of being the people. Also because in Latin, this is the etymology of liber, right? So the guy who is, in that sense, freed, right, freed man. But it's not just liber, it's libertus in Latin. And so this is an adjectivization of a past participle, basically, of a you have become, the idea that you have become a liber stands in libertus, because otherwise they would have not differentiated the term. And so libertus literally meaning belonging to the people, so that people that has liberated you, rather than you being part of that people, because now you are, but you are because you depend on that. And you know that in Roman law, the libertus was owed, at the moment of the enfranchisement, of course, obedience still to the former owners, right? And this was part of the aforementioned redemptional function that, in virtue, of course, of the strength of this individual, or in a sense even the weakness of the master, depending on what you look at, but the idea that at least becoming, in this sense, a Roman citizen, of course, the guy had been elevated to those standards because he had demonstrated to be good enough, he would pertain still to that people and obtaining the same Roman citizenship. Naturally, as I was saying before, by later times, there was a much more, also in the Roman world, a much more secular and modern way of looking at the thing, for which, even though there wasn't really a state, in checking ID cards and all this stuff, or having digitalized data banks or whatever, and so people really being regulated in very empirical ways. In fact, these people were still considered of a different value of the others, and of course, there were this famously mirrored by the various classes that would be affirmed also democratically within the Roman political system, for which there were people who were simply worthier than others and actually would monopolize the voting system as an oligarchy, right? So what, as we will see now, also the way the plebs had come to participate to the popular assemblies was not really much of a democratic process, in the sense that these people were to participate just being clients of somebody else that would just get more voting hands for his own faction, on which these people actually depended. So, of course, there is no such a thing like democracy in Rome, fortunately speaking. And also, of course, the term republican is referred to this common good rather than the sense of mere sense of republic, like meaning in an anti-sacred monarchic sense, like that. This is something we will not look at today, also because the Romans were, in a sense, trying to avoid that individual concentration of power, but they were not, of course, against at all the idea that there was an intrinsic divinity in some individuals, and that it was possible to actually to reattain it, which is the same idea of why eventually Augustus manages to reaffirm the monarchy in the wake of Caesar's divinity and more. So, by the end of the 4th century BC, the Roman citizens, that at the time was comprehended between 200 and 250,000 adult males. Remember that there is no such thing like, women can vote, or they're technically, they don't count. They're one with the man, right? That he's the head of the thing, and of course, men and women have this role of procreation, but also of coming back to one in their union, right? And so, and the man commands, because of course the Apollonian virile, Uranian principle governs over the telluric feminine and the Dionysian one in the process. That's why men bear arms, women can't, and this is incredibly and rigidly and patriarchally identitary in all kind of Indo-European cultures, like the myth that that nationalist, socialist feminists, they do exist, right? They try to stress, like, for example, in the Viking world, it was normal for women to be armed. No, it wasn't at all, right? And this is not just confusing Filces or other mythological figures with people, because of course there would be women who used arms, and not just, and there were actually actual warrior women, so not just armed settlers like the ones that we have mostly, but not exclusively found when saying, it's women bore arms. But the inherent principle, the archetypal principle that ruled the entire society, including the laws of these peoples, of course, well before any kind of Christianization, that didn't really even change much, telling the truth, in that sense, as everybody who has studied Germanistic knows, of course, have absolutely nothing to do with any right of the woman to bear arms whatsoever. It was just like a word upside down. If it happened for a reason, was exceptional and had to be investigated, and could be even be a positive one for that matter. This is not an anti-feminine or anti-feministic concept. It's the archetype that counts. Then how, effed up reality at a human level, and we will talk more about humanity now with the humiles. You already know where I'm gonna get with that. declines itself in the world is another matter, and we have to untangle it to eventually come back to one. Right? There were some Viking women warriors that eventually, after having slaughtered a great amount of people, simply settled down, sewing at home, living their housewife life. So the two things are actually and perfectly compatible. And so let's talk about the Comitia Curiata and the Comitia Centuriata. Now, the most interesting thing, by the way, about the term comitium being that it essentially stems from comitatus, from the ancient war bands of peoples. So it was, in the sense, an assembly of some sort, but specifically in the etymology, the one of wanderers, right? Of warriors that, just as Romulus Caelus were to, kidnap the enemy women, and founding new communities in the same way. So the idea is that these were almost, and as they would be, because the Curia and the Centuria, of course, were the single units, as you know, of the tribus, of the tribe as well, which, as we will see, also has the same identical etymology of the tripartite Indo-European order. And so these were literally the war bands in which the originary people was split in, right? That's where the Roman voting rights emerged from. By the way, at this point, the Comitia Curiata were largely just a traditional relic, vestige of royal times, where the citizens were grouped in 30 curiae. That comes from coviri, right? So the same actual etymology of quiritas that, as you know, was the meaning of the Roman people, as we see, so of the Romans, right? And you know that Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus were the original, say, sacred Capitoline trinity. As a matter of fact, in a caput, in a single hand, right? Later they would become actually Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, but those were later times. We look at the very origin. Of course, you have Jupiter as god, Mars as essentially the Holy Ghost, fundamentally, yes, he was the hero in that sense, but the transfiguring one. And the Quiritas were, there was this ambiguity, because you see also in Mars Ultor, and we know how this thing, like Mars was delivering the actual Holy Ghost through the sort of sacred soma, right? That essentially expressed the furor that was actually synonym, because we mostly know it for the barbarians, right? But it was actually the same idea of the virtus. The virtus was the same equivalent of the furor intended in that divine manifestation of the spirit that possessed you on earth, so the Holy Ghost, the winged victory, and so on. And the Quiritas, in this sense, were the people who were the sun, even, that had to rise to the one, as the Romans, that of course were destined to rule the world, because they were God's chosen people, without any doubt. That's how the Romans essentially did it. To make the long story short, they believed in it. That's the entire point. They were aware of what that confidence was all about in this. So, not bad for Comitia Curiata, right? How many times you would have studied this on history books without even wondering what it means, but it literally means this shockingly brutal, military, warrioristic, but not even, because it starts being soldiery. You see, remember the settling down, the civitas, that never underestimate how civilizations are made, never make the stupid mistake of confusing Rome for an anti-archetype of, say, warlike spirituality in the truly nobiliar Indo-European sense, which is a completely different thing. And this is true for the very soldiers also down the line, because they were the chosen people over all the other peoples. So even their soldiers from the Fourth Estate were a superior kind compared to the others. Remember this. Because that's literally what the Romans believed. If you wonder why they scattered arenas all over the empire, especially the western part. We will talk about that. I have something planning, not in counting really, but on gladiators, and there is a reason why the Romans were specifically fixated with gladiators compared to other peoples that didn't quite have the same thing. Bloodlust, right? Especially taste for decapitations, but we will talk about this another time. But as we were saying, the Comitia Curiata had, for say, certain political social mechanisms that today we did not analyze, come by the 4th century to be merely, again, this older vestige. However, it was convened for certain formal acts, the most important of which was voting, by the way, the Lex de Imperio, which actually is a pretty important one, and that's also why it had been maintained in that traditional form. It was actually more important than the Comitia Centuriata, all right? Because the first are these men that are, and noble men are essentially gathering together. The Centuria there, it is also, as you know, like the same, more or less the same group for most of Indo-European languages, counting the 100 is mostly referring just like to a unit of some kind, the decimal Indo-European step, like form of organization. Now, the Lex de Imperio was particularly important because it essentially conferred as a law the investiture of the imperium to the magistrates. So literally the way God's chosen people was to confer collectively the Holy Ghost, like to share it, right, to confer it to those who really deserved it, from, you see, also the bottom up, because of course the magistrates were less than the people voting them, and that were in that sense just there. The ones they would have obeyed their orders, right? The entire people would have been ruled by, and through the imperium, you know that some magistracies were conferred with the imperium, even in smaller ways, right? Then I don't know, the praetor had it, but also the quaestor for some things I think had a minimal of imperium. The consul being, of course, the guy or the guys actually, because of course it was a collegial magistracy, notoriously enough. So it's not really devoid of importance. Actually, it has a very important sacred meaning. The Curiae, however, would be soon substituted by 30 lictores, clearly demonstrating how these institutions would lose its own importance. You know, the etymology of lictor, it comes from the probably Indo-European leg, which means to bind, hence the fasces and the lictorian fasces. So as you understand, the popular assembly here was identifying with the army, right? Every Curia and Centuria was voting by itself because it was considered to be just part of an autonomous unit that eventually had to be just commanded through the hierarchy that they themselves had to vote. So just like in the true sense of the hero, of the bear, that had to command them. The Comitia Centuriata are the most important, right? Because they represent the people divided at this point in 5 classes and 193 centuriae, all of which constitutes a voting unit. So that the first class, as we were hinting at before, with its 98 centuriae composed by the most affluent citizens, actually owned the absolute majority, right? The centuriae had been, you know, they were also properly a Roman unit that would continue throughout basically forever, because still, like in, I don't know, at the time of Justinian, we find centurions, and it had been affirmed, like when the army had been articulated like that, right? And as a consequence, this went in parallel with the establishment of the Popular Assembly summoned by Centuria, hence the Comitia Centuriata. This privilege of the first class that we observed, that of course is identified in a democratic fashion, because at this point, of course, like all these people are well landed, and the wealth is concentrated, particularly also in Rome. As we'll see, that there is both, let's say, a territorial and a social divide in this sense. But this privilege was rendered even stronger by the voting mechanism, in virtue of which, in a first phase, it was the knightly centuriae to vote first, while in a later time it was from within the centuriae of the first class that it was, say, the centuria randomly extracted through source, that was a veritable deity, was called to be, say, to vote first, right? Hence the prerogative, as it was known also in Latin, the vote of which more often than not determined the vote of the following centuriae, right? This aspect is very important. As far as the knights are concerned, always remember that these were the true heroes, right? In the Roman view, there is no greater myth than the alleged weakness of Roman cavalry in the early times. It's probably the citizenry one. The Romans had pretty darn good cavalry, and they took an enormous care of selecting it. The knights were essentially also in this military system that from the Camillian reforms was starting to include, as we've seen, the plebeians, maintaining, in fact, an exceptional status, because, as we said before, fighting, right, bearing arms, participating to the Roman exercitus as a member of the populace, and so as a bear, as a Roman citizen proper, was not just a duty, but a privilege, right? Remember that he who bear arms is, in the eyes of God, carrying a part of imperium and was considered noble, especially considering this, that the Roman people ruling over other peoples and having this divine mandate of world conquest. Well, this is the reason why the Roman soldier had, which is sort of a nonsense to call it soldier, at least the Roman warrior had to initially contribute to his own equipment. As you know, this was surpassed not with Marius, but since the siege of Veii, right? Because, of course, as I like to say, it was not like the random, Italic peasant who left for campaign just with his cheese and salami in his back and saying hi to his wife and, providing for his own equipment in a literal sense. The idea was that as long as you were free, you were also self-sufficient in the sense that so there was a divine binding, an ecumenic, like an ecclesiastical one, like of Catholic Holy Ghost binding these warriors together. Of course, were fallen because they weren't immortal deities, but that had this higher status in cosmologically over the rest of the peoples, exactly because they were the better co-oriented, in fact, towards God. And so you had to contribute by yourself to your own armament. The equites, the knights, did not have this because they were seen in the, again, ancestral equestrian obsession that really every single Indo-European people, even the sedentary ones in Europe, like in this case, were really representing everywhere, was meant to be so necessary for the collective salvation of the people, that the same the same ladder would provide them with the means for their craft. Specifically, there were some equites that were literally provided with the war horse by the state. This is something you find actually also in the Middle Ages in some communes. There is the Restaur, for example. This was actually true in the feudal world as well, but I mean also in among citizens, among republics, you find the same identical functioning, because of course the war horse cost a freaking lot, and the knights had in many ways also together with the rest of the elite this hegemonic role as in the community, so to be able to impose politically such contribution from the people that just by conferring it to them was admitting that they needed their protection in a seigneurial and feudal sense, like Rome had been in this, always remember it, rigid hierarchy that of course contemplates there are better people and worse people in any case, and these classes were essentially formalizing from an administrative point of view, right? Then we'll talk more about the source and how, in fact, there was this actual extraction, like in the lottery, which was considered sacred, right? Because the randomness of it reflected the military aspects of gambling that, as you know, pertains to the second person of the Clausewitzian Trinity. More of that later, and that I also explained in the video about the Fortuna Caesaris, which in fact characterizes the military effort. And so this unknown, also Tacitus speaks about this among the Germans, this sort of trial of luck that would sort of dictate the moment from the divinity in this randomness that cannot be grasped by man, like the actual decision, the actual divine will. And in the Comitia Centuriata, the majority, once obtained, brought an end to voting, obviously. In practice, the second class, as you understand, would vote rarely, and the third one only in exceptional cases. Remember, the first one monopolized everything, so there could be someone who wouldn't make the actual, who was against that, and so wouldn't make the actual majority. That first class that basically was all plus one, and so at that point, you would have had these other classes voting, and that tiny bit that normally could be left out could be simply couldn't simply overthrow the vote. I mean, it was impossible for all the rest of the community. It was also the majority to simply vote opposite to that, because, as we will explain better now, this was the case again. All these people were clients, also the guys belonging to the first classes, and they depended on them in many ways, right? So the Comitia Centuriata elected the curule magistrates, the military leaders, the censors, and further voted the important laws, such as the constitutional ones. They declared war, right? That's what this people in arms, as we've seen, the assembly. At least this is better expressed by the Comitia Curiata etymologically, as we've seen, but they were literally this. They had to decide whom to go at war against, because they were the people in arms themselves. The Romans, especially at this point, had essentially molded themselves as a warrior people that goes at war every single year and has to decide where to strike, which land to seize, which people to take it from, because that's how eventually these people are going to gain more importance and just create more voting districts for that matter, at least to some extent. Then we have the Comitia Tributa. Tributa comes from tribus, which means tribe, from the Proto-Italic tritus, from the Proto-Indo-European trido, which literally means to put, place, set, in, especially render in tree and triparty, right? So this of course comes from the tripartite order of the Indo-Europeans. So with the Romans, you know that the original three tribes were the Ramnes, the Tethys, and the Luceres, that had in fact all specific functions according to the European tripartition among the warriors, the priests, the people in a sense. So the Ramnes would be the Latin, Romulian warrior stock. This is not strictly connected with the etymology, but the Tethys would have been the Sabites, so this people that was actually ruled in part by Rome. Actually, part of Rome, probably also the ancient city of the time, was Sabina already. Just like a part of Rome is the one just across the river is Etruria, and the Luceres had to do with this, the idea of the sacred places, the sacred groves and forests, mostly connected with the Etruscan, religious, powers that, in a sense, had impressed the Romans. Also, in in that sense of the Lucumons, speak about the king, priest, and there is so much to say here. I'm just brutally approximating and cutting just to make you understand, but this is all there, just for those who want to appreciate the Indo-Europeanness of Roman culture. Just know that this is literally how this stuff came around. Now, the Comitia Tributa represented the people subdivided per tribes that, as you know, had increased over time with the expansion of the Roman ager and the actual people that lived on it. So they had, however, passed themselves over time, like from territorial to personal, in a sense. And they were expanding, just welcoming the humiles now. So we're talking literally the fourth estaters, workers. Remember that only slaves work ideally, so the fourth estate is technically that one, the proletarians, because the vir doesn't work. This is something you find also in the Celtic culture. So the idea is that you control other people as a lord, right, working for you, and that the same slaves do, and that's why the aforementioned Romans were considered to be the populace, as the elite in arms, whereas the rest of the plebs of the humiles would actually work to sustain them as warriors. That was the feudal Rome, and that's how it had always been working. Now, in the 4th century, things had changed, and this had come with reforms. First of all, it had the Comitia Tributa stemmed from, as a background, from the deep struggles we were talking about before between the patricians and the plebeians. That is also a very overly simplified concept of the wall, but there were powerful plebeians as well that were, in this sense, also the ones who were elected were not just, the average shoemaker in the Suburra, right? And so but they had matured that social status before something else. It's just like saying, thinking closer times to us, in the 18th century revolutions, like who's the bourgeois compared to the nobleman? So today we wink at the bourgeois, but those are third estaters that are worse than the upper caste, and that simply, however, won their own space anyway, and so we sort of mostly identify with them. I'm a third estater with 1/4 of higher estate and a half of fourth estate in the origin, that God knows, because back in the day things can get in fact mythical and maybe heroical, right? And we all descend from the gods after one, so that's always the point. And in any case, that in this frangent, the plebeians had organized themselves initially and illegally. They had also tried to secede properly from the Roman community. Think about the Aventine, how that had come to be like the opposite of the Capitolium, and that's how the Concilia say the Comitia Tributa eventually are known, but they had started as Concilia Plebis Tributa, right? Concilium means like just to convene, right? You know, it stems etymologically from con, which is with, and calo, which stands for calling, announcing solemnly, to call out in Latin, right? Plus ium, which is basically giving the substantive to the word. And it stems from the Proto-Italic from calo, which also comes from the Proto-Indo-European kel, which is exactly to call, where the same call in English comes from, to shout, right? Because in these assemblies, people spoke like to be heard by all. The warriors originally had to be known, and still, like in Rome, of course, especially with all these peoples out there, as we've seen, but being pretty messy. And it was a very oral world out there. Also a very public one. That's like this concilia originally were attended by indiscriminately. Also, we know too few about them, and you can imagine also the intersections coming from the political intrigues and more. Speaking of this, there had been a reform in 312 that had essentially regularized the concilia. This came with the first of all, there was the Lex Hortensia from the dictator Quintus Hortensius that had been resolving the problem of the debts contracted by the plebs. I made a video specifically about the debts during the Roman conquest of Italy. Exactly at this point, we are at the end of the Samnitic Wars, right? And they basically solved this debt, or part of it. And the concilia plebis are essentially equated to the Comitia Centuriata in order to issue laws for all the people. So they had a different origin, but they sort of were in parallel to the Curiata, as we've seen. These were the most important, as you know, in Roman history. And there are really lots of more complex issues connected with this. Again, we will make much more in-depth videos because this is just an introduction. So the plebeian tribunes that are chosen by these assemblies can participate to the same senatorial meetings. Just think how it had been born, like in this conflictual way. But they would become so important, witnessing, in fact, in this 4th century, the importance of the Roman people for the army, because now they have been given also as plebeian magistrates, a part of the imperium. Like, as you know, an enormous power. They had veto power, for example. They could summon the senatorial meetings as well. And Appius Claudius, that had first opposed the plebeians as far as the sacerdotal offices was concerned, would eventually support them. And having this law passed in 312, that allows basically the Romans to essentially subscribe to the tribe that they preferred. And this allows many Roman citizens that, and especially the citizens of the city of Rome that were priorly the minority against the ones of the rural district of Rome in the countryside, to actually gain the majority in the Concilia Plebis Tributa, for the simple fact that they could be more easily physically present to the sees, right, to the assemblies, while the others would have not had the chance to frequently abandon their fields in the countryside and coming to vote there. So also the Concilia Tributa that were born out of a plebeian whim, to say the least, actually become a source of, say, oligarchic strengthening within the Roman world, because it allows properly Rome to acquire more power, also over the same Roman citizens that have the same vote, say every vote counts the same, that, however, had settled in the countryside. And remember that those who had settled in the countryside more often in the ager publicus were also these soldiers that had fought, like in the Roman conquest of Italy against the Samnites, etc., that naturally were not so affluent to live in Rome. It was becoming so very expensive, and they had finally gotten their plot of land, but in this sense gradually lost political powers as well. And that's how, in a way, in perspective, already the seeds of the second century recruitment crisis were sown at this point. This also allowed, by the way, the liberty to vote. So the freedmen who lived in Rome, and so all these guys who belonged to, for example, Appius Claudius had this friend who was Cneius Flavius that now could vote simply, and it made number, it made mass, and so from Rome they could decide much more than this other Roman citizens would. So this has nothing to do with democracy. It's not meant to be. It has to be. It has to do with who has actual power, who has the capacity to wield power, right? And favoring the urban plebs and the freedmen means to favor the aristocracies that command them, and from which the rurals had been, up to that point at least, rather independent politically. And this would allow actually the same Roman elite to invest ever more, because a lot of wealth came just from this mechanism additionally, and to occupy ever larger amounts of the ager publicus that in theory could be settled by every Roman citizen because they were freemen. They could do whatever they wanted, but that in this sense would bring at some point some landowners to be so many more powerful than others, and even having this, I don't know, their slaves kicking out the freemen out of a field and simply seizing it, and so gradually impoverishing that again recruitment mechanism through the status of the same legionaries. Hence all the issue that would lead to the Marian reforms, the fact that you didn't need any wealth actually to be enlisted, you just needed to be a Roman citizen, right? And this is really important. And speaking of the etymology of humiles, well, I think I don't have to really explain who these were. I mean, it means the humble, the poor, but the etymology is interesting because, of course, even though it's easy, it comes from homos, Proto-Italic, which comes from Thomas, that is the Proto-Indo-European dogmos, and dagom, that is the earth, from which humus, right? And so literally means the dirty ones, the ones that are closer to the earth. And so, as we were saying before, are the lesser people, because they are in status closer to that fall from heaven that we were talking about before, and they're more chthonic and vulgar and like Anapollonian, let's say. This was changing a lot in Roman culture, because, of course, if you mix these people together with the others, of course, was the sense that, again, by depending by the more powerful people, they would be elevated themselves more, and that's definitely the case. And there is a Romanity also in the city of Rome that is very often underestimated in terms of actual power. Like the Roman corporations, guilds had actually a great deal of power also in imperial times. There was a great sense of those who lived in Rome that also would live on in the Middle Ages, and their role in the empire, the imperial elections, by the way, considered this in literally the fact that also in the Middle Ages, as we've seen, not just the Pope has to crown you Holy Roman Emperor, but the Roman people, they're present, which is technically the Roman barons, the Roman nobility, in fact, still at that point, had to accept that as well. And that was part of the actual ceremony. If you didn't have that, you couldn't become an emperor. So that's quite telling of how truly continuous the Roman traditions were at this point. Now, the Comitia Tributa also elected the lesser magistrates. It voted in the plebiscites for example, the plebiscita, because the plebs, in fact, was essentially being asking, right? And they also had judiciary competence for the questions connected with a public crime, the penalty of which would be limited to a fine, essentially. So they were not given, say, capital power, right? You could administrate capital punishment. But the tribunes, as you know, were sacred, so you couldn't kill them, which is also when that happens, as you know, in the later 2nd century BC, like a bit like when, say, the so-called republic gets in agony, because since the 4th century, the plebeian element had been so crucial to keep things together. After all, as it had sort of always been in many ways, but now with a greater valor of, at least in the 4th century, of the individual, now armed plebeians, that would eventually fall a little bit later, hence also that violation of the potestas tribunitia. Now, in aside from this, you have another a plebeian assembly, which is known as the concilium plebis, that is reminiscent of the initial conventicles that the plebeians had during the times of secession, and this was reserved to the sole plebs. As we've seen from 312, everybody could participate to the Comitia Tributa, all right? But the concilium plebis was just for the plebeian. It was summoned by a tribune, where the same, in fact, Comitia Tributa Comitium Tributum is summoned, and it thus presided by a magistrate provided with the imperium, right? A plebeian magistrate with imperium. You know what's the etymology of imperium, right? It stems from, of course, the concept of the Holy Ghost. Like, mostly in Latin itself means to command, to give orders, to impose, to demand, right? And it comes from imparo in this sense, verbally, from the Proto-Indo-European pair, which means to provide, from pair further to grant, and it's cognate with pario, which is also to produce, proper, ready. In Old Irish, you have erdnite, which is to grant, to bestow. In Sanskrit, you have this other prati, that means to grant, to bestow. In Hellenic, ancient Hellenic, you have eperon, which is give, to furnish. So it was the idea that you could dispose of power as much as God had disposed of his. And so conferring down the hierarchical line this victory, right, that came with the through the actions of the people who deserved this, of course, right, and the instrument of world domination. Starting from the moments in which the plebiscites started to have value of law in Rome, you would have the tendency to confuse, however, the two assemblies, I mean the Comitia Tributa and the Concilium Plebis, considering that the plebs, that was the only one admitted in the Concilium, resulted, however, majority also in the Comitium Tributum, which, as we've seen, was held in the same place where eventually the Concilium was. So that was just like a subdivision of, say, this plebeian discourse, so we can say that was particularly useful, at least in a, say, for internal issues to of the plebs. But say today we don't have too much to add, except the fact that, of course, we are looking at, as you understand, very old institutions that were still held in Rome of enormous consideration for the centuries to come, exactly because of the balance that had rendered Rome the rule of Italy, and from there the one of the Mediterranean and beyond. Because the political cohesion that Rome had provided herself with at this point had been the one that had rendered that result in the first place. So this is not just a matter of, say, they organized themselves like this for some broader reason. This was a society, truly, we're talking about the 4th century, organized for war, right? And there isn't much else to point out, really, except the fact that, of course, these are topics that they just exemplified, listed in, in a sense that would be understandable. Of course, there is a lot of, let's say, political history behind this that is very interesting to observe in the details. But the actual fundamentals of the Roman so-called republic are these ones. Like, they come from this originary meanings and the mentality that was actually very close to still to one of the origins, if you think about it. Of course, it was very, very sort of different from the time of the Italic migrations, but it was also very, say, it was not too far away in at least from the, considering this was the beginning of what we start considering more familiarly Roman, at least because we've not really been told much in pop culture, but the properly tribal nature of the original stories, the original sagas of Roman history. It's mostly a matter of, civic stuff, political, but emptied in that secular modern way. Naturally, anybody who has read them knows that there is a deeper meaning, a truly, again, a almost chivalric one, as a matter of fact, especially before this time, but still leaving true and further, because the principles of this society, the principles of this culture were essentially the same. And great part of them actually lives throughout the ages among so many different peoples, and we have much more, in fact, to consider in terms of what is that really, you see, when we talk about democracy, for example, like, we tend to think that, say, that we're literally talking real democracy. It's positive that nobody ever lived in a real democracy, because democracy does not work. At best, we live in a place in which everybody can vote, but fortunately there is somebody else that controls the government, gets the power from the people by saying something that they will make them vote for them. But of course they need expert, qualified people, not the masses of lesser people to rule, that take decisions based on intelligence and not on just the broader moral support that can, however, be given by people who do not have the technical means, of course, to understand how to run the business, right? So that's not democracy. Democracy is the dictatorship of the proletariat. It really belongs to some other, mental delusion and disturbance. A republic is something else, because the republic is, say, it was never a Roman republic in an institutional sense, like today we understand republics to be a specific type of government. The res publica was a concept. And yes, the Roman people overall would consider themselves, first of all, as a people, but also in this commonwealth, right, of the Roman people, as the res publica. And so a concept that is very that would make a great video topic for that matter. Like, what is the res publica, strictly meant, and not just through the Roman ages, but rather in the original sense, which more or less would remain. So reflect on the fact that when we vote and when we actually respect what we call improperly democracy, we're actually, which does work in the way it does, and it still does, and it does in the most advanced countries in the world. It doesn't do outside, in case you didn't notice. because people are weaker in those places, and so they can be more tyrannically used. Like we can, if we were to simply rule individually, we would be God ourselves. So we are still fallen, but we are at the upper level, and that's a traditional legacy. That's something that begins as early as this and before. Like if we look at Greece, that was, however, a bit different from Rome, but not, at least in the original sense of at least at this point they were different, of course, but Rome was way more primitive and warlike and sort of imperially minded, in fact. And up to a certain extent, because it depends on what you call like Hellenic in that regard. This is the same century of Alexander, for that matter, so not necessarily the polis of the previous centuries. And even that was a recent relative novelty, right? But it did work differently from Rome. It was more oligarchic, but in the sense also more driven from the actual people, who were that militarized in a much greater sense, so they had greater moral force. But it's part of real tradition. Be extremely wary at opposing like warriorism to civilization, because we crushed warriors under our heels a very long time ago, right? And we did because, of course, we were intrinsically superior as a civilization. And this is what I think, through the Indo-European etymology of the same very terms of the Roman political vocabulary, really should make you think about the actual world in which we live and why we abide to those principles still, and what in fact does work in them, because they are pure tradition. Modernity more like an absence of tradition. All what works in what we call modernity is actual tradition. That's what I was telling you. Democracy does not exist. Modernity does not exist. It's just another way to call the absence of something else. And in ways that at least we distracted from the reality of the actual substance of government, aside from the form. Because form is more important than substance, but the substance is still important, so there are some compromises as a fallen kind that you must make materially, right? But it always gets down to the reality and of the divine command, and so divine power stemming from any positively accomplished action. Very well. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.